Why is it relevant to talk about libertarianism and socialism in ancient Rome? The most fundamental purpose of this essay is to demonstrate the presence in ancient Roman history of some universals: libertarianism, capitalism, and collectivist socialism. How do we understand these terms of libertarianism and socialism? The most relevant approach to us is that of Friedrich Hayek. Libertarianism is a practice based on individuals and their inalienable rights. Individualism, producing a spontaneous order, fair because it results from individual action and responsibility through the free play of the market and individual freedom. The state limits itself to its sovereign functions of maintaining order, defending the city, and acting as the last resort judge when arbitration is impossible. Conversely, socialism is the practice based on society considered as a whole, holism, and expressed through the state. The state must not only ensure sovereign functions, but in order to establish social justice, organize society, regulate the economy, dictate production, distribute wealth, and replace individual choices with administrative planning decisions. Hayek has the advantage of synthesizing a definition of socialism that applies to all its forms of expression. While libertarianism and socialism are inherently opposed, they are both ends of a continuum ranging from total individual power over oneself, also called freedom, to the state's total power over the individual, which can aptly be called servitude. Imagine a frieze with, on one side, a purely spontaneous order, total individual freedom, absolute property rights, and absence of any state power, that is, anarchy, which is not synonymous with chaos. This theoretical system is referred to as anarcho-capitalism. At the other end, you would find a model of pure organization, a total absence of individual freedom, non-existent property rights, and a fully realized totalitarian state. In between, a mix of freedom and state presence in which we find the minimal state, night watchman state, then the interventionist state, etc. This explains why we can find socialists committed to some individual freedom. They are socialists farther from the totalitarian end than others. Conversely, libertarians favoring social policies which by definition impose servitudes on property rights, foremost among them taxation. They will be further from the anarchist end of the frieze. In summary, and as far as basic principles are concerned, libertarianism is the primacy of individual freedom, socialism that of collective organization. This is how we will understand these terms throughout our demonstration. We discard teleological interpretations that make socialism the pursuit of a perfect world and a new man, as this is ideology, and its real influence is hard to measure exactly in Roman public policies. If we choose the Hayekian approach, it is precisely because, based on practices rather than ideologies, it is applicable to the known Roman historical facts. What we are saying and want to show is that successive Roman practices in political, social, and economic matters, mainly intuitive and empirical, correspond to those implemented today by men driven by an ideology with a solidly developed doctrine. Roman libertarianism is first and foremost, historically, the concern to avoid tyranny forever. To do this, the Romans created a whole legal and institutional arsenal whose effectiveness probably went beyond their initial concerns. Not only was freedom well protected in Rome, but this reign of law favored the economic dynamism of the city and its prestige abroad, giving it a comparative advantage over the rest of the ancient world, which conferred it an extraordinary resilience and an ability to deploy gigantic forces, ultimately leading to its supremacy. To protect themselves from tyranny, the Romans used two complementary means: limiting the power of leaders and affirming fundamental individual rights. Avoiding tyranny by the separation of powers. For the first 2 centuries of its history, Rome was a city marked by the influence of the neighbouring Etruscan civilization. As the kings of Rome came from this culture, we can say that the first Rome was dominated by a monarchy of foreign origin. In 509 BC, the city freed itself from the Etruscan yoke by driving out its last king, Tarquin the Proud, apparently under the leadership of its aristocrats. These patricians, the native Romans, descendants of the city's founders, established the oligarchic regime of the Senate over the city, the assembly of patrician family heads who had already governed with the king before the monarchy was overthrown. The cause of this overthrow being precisely the king's claim to govern without the Senate, which would have constituted a tyranny. To replace the executive power of the king, the aristocrats created a system of dual magistracies, in which competition between 2 magistrates of equal status was to ensure probity through mutual surveillance, and prohibit dictatorship by joint exercise of power. This was notably the case with the consulate, the supreme magistracy. Each had the right to veto the acts of the other, and the magistracy was extremely limited in time, just 1 year. The tribunate towards the end of the patrician oligarchy. Opposite the patricians of the Senate we find the plebeians, that is, the non-patricians, a class of the population that was formed under the monarchy by the influx of immigrants. In order to integrate into the city, to obtain economic rights and a legal status, newcomers had to attach themselves to patrician families in the manner of ancient patronage, a kind of feudalism involving mutual assistance between patron and client, the patron protecting and providing for the client's needs, the client politically supporting the patron. But this client status also entailed obligations to the city. Indeed, since he only existed legally through his link with his patron, that same link placed on him the military duties incumbent on his patron. However, during the last decades of the monarchy, the frequency of wars made these obligations very heavy, and many plebeians preferred to detach themselves from their patron and lose their economic and political status, rather than fulfilling these duties. The need to find soldiers forced the patricians to make the client status more attractive. They allowed their clients to own land, a legal capacity that had hitherto been reserved for patricians alone. Plebeians thus obtained real economic power, but without the patricians granting them political rights. Yet history teaches us that the distortion between economic and political weights causes the greatest revolutions. And it happened in Rome in what is called the conflict of the orders, a political struggle for the civil rights of the plebeians, an immigrant population or of immigrant descent, against the patricians. In 495, just 15 years after the overthrow of the monarchy, the plebeians decided to go on strike and not fight for the patricians. This is the secession of the plebs, during which the plebeian people literally left the city and retreated to the Aventine Hill. The standoff ended with concessions from the patricians. A special magistracy was created for the plebs, modelled on the patrician magistracy of the consuls. It is the tribunate, which is reserved for the plebs and must defend its interests before the Senate government. This is the first legal guarantee of the rights of the plebeians. Others would follow. The reign of law, a guarantee against the arbitrariness of power. The tribunate allowed the plebs to organize politically and educate themselves in political play. In the middle of the 5th century BC, the plebeians made a decisive demand. They demanded that the laws and prerogatives of the patrician consuls be written down in order to establish legal security through the publicity of the rule of law, hitherto known and interpreted by the consuls in an arbitrary manner. Written in 450 and 449, promulgated under pressure from a second plebeian secession, these legal rules will be known as the Law of the 12 Tables, because they were published on the Roman Forum on 12 bronze tablets. They constitute the first written corpus of Roman laws. From now on, the law is public and known to all. This event is essential, as the publication of the laws is a legalization of freedom. The existence of a reliable written law corresponds to a reliable and guaranteed freedom. What the law does not prohibit is permitted. What the law covers is legal. Roman libertas will be understood in this sense, namely the set of rights that individuals can claim. In this respect, the 12 Tables constitute a true Roman Bill of Rights. It lays the foundation for the mos maiorum, this custom of the elders, which will long be the pride of the Romans, and will represent in the mouths of the orators of the Republic a set of inalienable rights. For the Romans, justice was not originally a high moral notion, but the much more concrete idea that everyone obeys the same written, reliable law, the jus scriptum, and is protected from the arbitrariness of the magistrates originally by the 12 Tables. It is exactly the idea of the rule of law, the common relationship to an objective standard applying to all. This law of the 12 Tables had such prestige that, says Cicero, Roman children learned it by heart at school. At this moment in Roman history, the plebs obtained the establishment of what should rightly be called the rule of law, a constitutionalist regime, concerned with the separation of powers into separate magistracies, consuls, praetors, and a guarantee of the fundamental rights of individuals. Let's look more closely at the exact content of these fundamental rights. Roman citizenship and its fundamental rights. Roman citizenship conferred on its holder a set of political, civil, and military rights, among which the jus connubii, the right to legal marriage and therefore to found a family with a Roman woman, the jus census, the right to property, the jus commercii, the right to buy and sell on Roman territory, which can be summarized as freedom of enterprise, and the jus legis actionis, the right to bring legal actions to assert one's rights before the Roman courts. These rights attached to Roman citizenship correspond perfectly, in their totality, to the three fundamental and inalienable natural rights defined 20 centuries later by the greatest English theorist of libertarianism and the rule of law, John Locke: the right to life and to found a family, the right to freedom, and the right to property in the broad sense, enjoyment, exchange, and production. To this, we must add the jus provocationis, the Romans' habeas corpus, by which any citizen could appeal to the tribune to protect himself from a decision by a magistrate he considered arbitrary, and which the plebeian magistrate could oppose by intercessio. What does this mean? That in Rome in the 5th century BC men were recognized and guaranteed the same natural rights that the British of the Glorious Revolution and the Americans would conquer 2,000 years later by their constitution. On this subject, let us make an important remark. Benjamin Constant, the leader of the French liberals during the early 19th century, differentiated freedom of the ancients and that of the moderns. The first would constitute participation in collective power and would not exclude the subjection of individuals to the authority of the whole, that is, a holistic conception, while the latter would be the freedom of the individual to do as he pleases by benefiting from the guarantees granted by the institutions. However, it is clear that the idea of Roman libertas, conceived as a set of inalienable individual rights, was much closer to Constant's modern conception of freedom, the one found in authors like Locke, the Enlightenment, or the drafters of the American Constitution, than the Greek conception, that of the ancients. In reality, Benjamin Constant's distinction, besides its schematic nature, is false in its chronological model. There is no difference between a freedom of the ancients and a freedom of the moderns. There is a difference between the individualist conception of freedom, which leads to the rule of law, and the collectivist conception, which leads to democracy. Constant was therefore right to distinguish two freedoms, but wrong to see an old one and a modern one. In reality, in antiquity, as in modern times, we find both: individual liberty and taxation. It is interesting for us to understand it in the continuation of our presentation, how Rome switched from the individualist conception to the collectivist conception, which ultimately led to imperial dictatorship in the name of the masses, and how it did so without abandoning the idea of freedom, but by changing its meaning. Economically, the regime at the beginning of the Republic was practically an example of minarchism. While under the monarchy, toll rights and octroi were added to the requirement of forced labour, the Republican state was strictly limited to the exercise of regalian functions, and direct taxation was limited to the sole tributum ex census, which financed war expenses, the Republic having no other bureaucracy than the magistracies exercised by citizens for free. The populares was considered an exceptional contribution, the principle being the non-subjection of citizens to any tax whatsoever, which would have been considered a servitude. The meagre administrative staff serving the magistrates, as well as cult expenses, were financed by the exploitation of public goods, directly or privately against payment, as well as various indirect taxes similar to those of the monarchy, tolls, octroi. The Roman accusatory justice system. As for justice, it presented itself as an accusatory system in which a dispute is brought before the courts only to the extent that a complainant decides to take legal action. It is then up to each party to try to convince the judge. To conclude the procedure, the parties can negotiate an agreement without going to judgment. Conversely, in the inquisitorial system, it is the state that takes legal action with or without a complainant, and negotiation to end the dispute is impossible in matters of delinquency and crime, since the prosecution of the trial does not depend on the civil party, the complainant, but on the public prosecutor. This type of procedure is more collectivist in inspiration, since it is based on the idea that society is affected by delinquent behavior beyond the persons of the culprits and victims, so all repression must be conducted taking into account the entire social body. The accusatory system is therefore a much more libertarian judicial system than the inquisitorial system. It leaves much more room for individual initiative, for negotiation opportunities. And the state, if it were a party to the trial, would not have a more advantageous role than any individual. Whereas the inquisitorial system embodies a vision of the state's superiority supposedly representing the entire society. It should also be noted that the praetor, the magistrate in charge of justice, did not, at the beginning of the Republic, have to decide on private litigations, as this was the role of the arbiter or iudex, a mere individual freely chosen by the parties. There was no state judge. The praetor only intervened in the first part of the trial to set the legal framework for the procedure. But the Romans of the young Republic refused the intervention of the state's power in resolving their disputes. Its role was exclusively to substitute, by authority, a legal and therefore peaceful means of conflict resolution for private violence. This is precisely the role of a strictly regalian state, a night watchman state, to banish violence from relationships within society, however without regulating these relationships, which would be the case later in the time of the empire. Another tangible sign of the limitation of the state's role can be seen in the area of policing. The Roman police of the early Republic, the armed personnel capable of implementing the magistrate's coercitio, was limited to 24 lictors for tens of thousands of inhabitants. Libertarian yet not democratic. The Roman political, social and economic regime of the 5th century BC was therefore undeniably libertarian, even if it was not yet democratic and entirely isonomic. There was indeed equality of civil rights, but not political rights between plebeians and patricians. However, this very distinction was to fade in the years and decades that followed. In 445, the Lex Canulea allowed marriages between patricians and plebeians, and then lower magistracies became accessible to plebeians. In 376 BC, the supreme magistracy, the consulate, became accessible to plebeians, and not only accessible, but it was imperatively shared. Of the two consuls, one had to be a patrician, the other a plebeian. The Senate also opened up to the plebeians and ceased to be a purely patrician assembly. The aristocracy became a mix of patricians and enriched plebeians, thus an aristocracy by merit. Some will object that this was not a democracy but an open oligarchy, that there were slaves, and that speaking of libertarianism under these conditions is exaggerated. We will respond in addition to the demonstration above showing profound Roman libertarianism, evident in the rights guaranteed by the law, and the concern for a state freed from the arbitrariness of one or a few, that Rome was probably the best that could be done in terms of libertarianism in an environment where, less than 2 centuries earlier, relationships were marked by archaic tribal organization and most individuals having no legal status. Indeed, the Roman political system by the end of the 5th century was closer to early 19th century America than to 10th or 18th century France. It was closer both in spirit and in the reality of its institutions. Its intrinsic libertarianism is undeniable. The Romans of the early Republic had little concern for democracy since they had achieved the rule of law. The demand for democracy is only a real issue when the state is powerful and organizes income redistribution and privileges. In a regime like the Roman Republic of the 5th or 4th century, where the state sphere is limited to allowing everyone to assert their rights equally, seizing power is hardly a source of profit, and consequently hardly desired. This is probably the reason why Rome never became a democracy like Athens, because it had managed much better than its Greek predecessor to restrict the state's sphere of intervention, and the fact that the government was oligarchic did not lead to major dysfunctions, though this would eventually change with the significant enrichment of the Roman state through military predation.